Today I'm starting a several-part screencast on creating a gem for use in a Ruby on Rails application. The gem I'll be creating will allow us to have application settings that are configurable at startup, but are database backed with a caching layer on top. In this first part, we'll be focusing on creating our gem skeleton and setting up RSpec. Let's get started. So the first thing is you'll need to have Rails installed. You can check if you already have Rails installed with gem list Rails. You can see that I have Rails 4.04 installed, or you can gem install Rails if you don't already have it installed. Okay, so now using the Rails binary, we can create our gem skeleton with Rails plugin new, the name of our gem, which we'll call simply settings. And we want to pass the $T option to say that we don't want to use test unit since we'll be using RSpec. And then also, because we're using RSpec, we want our dummy Rails application to live in spec dummy instead of test dummy, since we won't have a test directory. All right. Let's hit enter. You can see that it's creating our gem skeleton and running bundle install now for us. Alright, let's take a look at what this will look like in Sublime Text, which is the editor that I prefer to use. You can see that we have a lib directory, which is where our gem code will live. It also gives us a task directory to create rake tasks, and then we have this simply settings directory, which is where all of our gem code will live that doesn't exist in this simply settings.rb. We also have a spec directory, which is where we'll put our tests, and you can see we have our dummy Rails application now inside of this directory. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do now that all this is set up is take a look at our gem spec. You can see that we have a development dependency on SQLite 3. We want to add another development dependency on RSpec Rails, since we're working with Rails applications. Let's bundle install so that we can use RSpec. We'll go back to Sublime Text, and I'm going to use the RSpec builder to run my tests using command B. And great, we have 0 failures but also 0 tests. So let's create our first test. We'll need to create a new file in our spec directory. We'll call it simply settings spec.rb. We'll describe simply settings. We'll just write a fake test in here saying something we know will be true. We'll say it is true, and we'll say we expect true to be true. We'll just run our test again to make sure everything's good here. Alright, so we have one passing test now, but it's not a real test, so let's do something a little better. But first, what we need to do is we still have some missing configuration for a dummy Rails application. We haven't yet configured it to use RSpec, so let's do that now. We need to go into spec dummy. First thing we want to do in here is symlink our gems spec directory so that they can be shared between the Rails application and our gem. Alright, you can see that worked. And now we want to install RSpec. We can do this with Rails G, which is short for generator, generate actually, and then RSpec install. Great, it created a spec helper for us. Now the spec helper is responsible for requiring all of the files in our Rails application. So it requires the Rails environment, and then also we'll have it require all of the files in our gem so that they're available to our tests. Let's go back to Sublime Text. We'll just run our tests again, make sure everything is good. They are good because we're not yet requiring our spec helper. So run them again, and this is expected because this path is not correct. The path that it should be pointed to load our Rails application. Need to look at our spec helper. It's actually located in spec dummy. Alright, let's run this again, make sure everything's good. Great. Our passing test is still passing and we have 0 failures. But we're not yet loading our gem code, so let's do that. We'll require that here on the next line. And we need to require lib simply settings. Great. All of our tests are still passing. So let's change this test so that it actually depends on our gem implementation. Now, when I'm writing tests, I like to have my test and my implementation side by side, so I'm going to split into 2 panes here, and I also like my tests to be on the right side for whatever reason. So on the left side here, I'm going to load the simply settings RB. I'm just going to close this directory tree because it's distracting. Okay, great. So we have this empty module simply settings. Let's create a class in here called base. And our settings are going to be a singleton, so we'll only have one instance of our settings. So we're going to include singleton module. And for now, we're just going to write a throwaway method, something that we can depend on. And we'll test drive this. Write a test first, and we'll say it has the name simply settings, and we expect simply settings base instance name to equal simply settings. Alright, let's run this. It should fail. It does fail because we get an error, undefined method. Okay, let's write our method. So we need to write def name, and it returns a string simply settings. Great. We now have a passing test that actually depends on our implementation code. So we're going to stop here today. The next screencast will dig a little bit deeper and implement at least most of the database backed aspect of this. And then in a follow-up screencast after that, and a third screencast, we'll add a caching layer on top.